sewers, I'm Debbie from Sew Simple Bags. I'm here today to introduce you to my sewing practice sheets. I've designed a number of sheets which will help brand new sewers. I'm a member of several Learn to Sew or Sewing Beginners Facebook groups, and one thing that I do notice over and over again, people ask so many times about how do I sew a straight line, and of course people come up with all kinds of gadgets like clip-on magnets and things like that that you can add to your sewing machine. But really I have found from my own practice and from teaching others to sew that the best way is just to practice. You need to get familiar with your own machine, where the needle falls, where you need to keep your eye when you're sewing, especially is it on the edge of your presser foot, is it in the middle, do you need to look at the edge of your fabric, do you need to look at the seam gauge on your sewing machine? There are so many areas that you can look at. You may think you're doing really great, and then when you take your work out of the machine, it's kind of wavy and wonky and really not as straight as you would like. There's lots more other skills that you can learn as well as straight stitching, such as zigzag stitching and getting your zigzags in the right place, sewing curves and turning corners. All of these things are covered by my sewing practice sheets. Let me take you through the pages that we have. This is the first page. This is the practice keeping the needle on the line. So this is a straight stitch. You're going to sew along here in straight lines. Now you might think that's a little bit repetitive, but actually your sewing machine does more than just one straight stitch. There are stitches of all different types of lengths. So this can also, as well as being a great sheet to practice straight stitching, it can also help you practice setting the stitch length on your machine, and afterwards the stitch guide here will show you where the needle falls, and you can keep this as a guide for later on. Mark up your stitch lengths on here, and then you can look at this later if you need to pick a certain stitch length to use for your project. All of these practice sheets are designed to be sewn without any fabric and without any thread. All you do is feed the paper practice sheet through your machine, and your needle punches the line as you sew on the paper, and it can help you look back later on. You see exactly where your needle fell, and it's really helpful. It doesn't waste any fabric or thread, and there are no problems with things like tension or bird nesting that beginners might not be ready to tackle yet. Practice sheet number 2 looks very similar. It also has straight lines. However, instead of sewing with a straight stitch, this one tells you to use a zigzag stitch. And the idea is that you will sew with your zigzag evenly on either side of the line. The next one is more practice for straight stitching, or for zigzags if you like, but also it helps you practice turning corners. The notes at the bottom of each sheet give you some tips or tell you how to use each sheet. So for this one, for example, it tells you to leave your needle down at the corner, lift the presser foot and rotate the paper. Lower the presser foot and continue sewing. And if you follow the instructions, you'll be able to practice turning corners on all of these corners just here and get really neat finish. The next one is for you to have a little bit of fun with. There are some straight lines, and of course there's lots of corners. So you decide how to sew. Sew up and down, or sew in like a maze, sew a zigzag, sew a few, turn left, sew a few, turn right, entirely up to you. Have a little bit of fun with this sheet. Uh-oh, now we're starting to get serious. With this one, you can see that the lines are much closer together. So indeed, you are going to still practice sewing straight. You're going to practice sewing on the line. You're going to practice turning corners. And of course, remember, you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. But here, if you overshoot any of these corners or you wiggle a little bit, you'll start to move into the next line because they are so close. So once you've practiced straight lines, this is where you go to next. This next sheet is similar, but for sewing circles and curves and wavy lines. You will start on the outer line and you can use a reasonably long stitch, but as you get smaller and the circles get tighter, you may need to find that you need to shorten your stitch length in order to be able to stay accurately on these lines. There's plenty of practice here. Again, you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise with your stitching. Once you finish all of the sheets, you will be a stitching master. And here, a little bit more fun, just some crazy shapes for you to practice on and see if you can still sew nice and slow and accurately and stay on the lines. So let's take these over to the sewing machine and actually have a go with them. Let's start first with the straight stitch. I'm going to just accept whatever is the standard default settings for the straight stitch on my machine. I've got no bobbin and I've got no thread in the machine. I'm just going to pop the needle down. Now my sewing foot has a number of little marks on it which help me to determine where my needle is going to fall. I've got a little mark right in the center, just down in there. So I'm going to keep my eye on the mark on my presser foot rather than actually on the needle. The needle is going to fall directly behind that mark. So I know that if that mark is on the line, that my needle is going to fall on the line too. I'm also going to turn down the speed on my sewing machine. The sewing machine is a bit like a car. The faster you put your foot down, the harder you put your foot down, the faster you're going to go. And when you are a learner, it's easy to let the car or the sewing machine take control, go too fast. Suddenly you're speeding, you're out of control and you have an accident. In this case, the worst that will happen is our accident is we would veer off the line. So we are going to turn it down as slow as possible if that has that kind of setting. Otherwise, take care with your presser, with your foot pedal, and just go nice and slow. And as I sew, I'm going to try and keep my needle on this line. So this is with my foot pressed all the way down on the foot pedal. So this is as fast as my machine will go on the slow setting. And I can see already I'm doing not too bad, but I'm not exactly falling on the line. Let's see if I can adjust it a little bit. There we go, that's probably a little bit better. So I'm just going to continue finishing this line all the way down to the bottom, and then we will change the stitch length on our machine so that we have a comparison next to it. Most sewing machines will do a pretty good job of sewing quite straight, and your job will be just to guide the fabric, in this case to guide the paper, so that the needle is falling exactly where you need it to, and so you're just straightening out the fabric or the paper as you sew. So my first line of stitching is done, and if I turn over to the reverse, now suddenly you can see all of the lines that your sewing machine punched in the paper, and you can see whether you've sewn a straight line. You can also hold this sheet up to the light and you can see where the light falls, where you're a little bit off the line or not. Okay, so let's increase the stitch length on my machine. This was a standard 2.5. If I put mine up to a 4, we should see the difference. And basically what happens is the little feed dogs, these ridged parts just here under the needle, these actually grab whatever you've got here under the presser foot and move it forward the set length according to how you've set your stitch. So I'll now pop this one under the presser foot and we will start. And you should notice that the paper actually feeds through further between each stitch. So it might not be immediately apparent when you're sewing, but when we get to the end of the line, and then we hold that up to the light or look from the reverse, we should see that the gap between the holes in the stitching is longer than the initial line that I sewed. Let's take it out and have a look. So there I think you can see the difference. This is the first line, and here this is the second line with the longer stitch length. Mine goes all the way up to a stitch length of 5, so I could make it that little bit longer again. And again we'll sew a little more, and I'm using my hands, my fingers, just to gently guide the paper so that it stays nice and straight, and my needle should be falling more or less on that line that we have there. Let's take a look. And here, slightly longer again, this is my 5 stitch length. So if 2.5 was my standard, say for some reason I wanted a really tiny stitch, this is now down to a 1.4. Let's give that a try. And this time it's much, much closer together. So if I wanted to sew all the way down to the end of this line, I would have many more stitches than if I was sewing with the longer stitch length. This is going to take forever, so let's take it out and have a look already. And there we go, you can see this is the much smaller 1.5 stitch length. So this can be a handy guide later on. If you were to write here 1.5, 2.5, 4 and 5, it would be a handy guide later on so that you could look at your stitch lengths. So that's the straight stitch sheet. Let's have a look at zigzag stitches next. So the idea with our zigzag stitch is that we're going to keep that little guide or the middle of the presser foot down this line. And then the idea is what would happen is our needle will zigzag equally on the either side of that line. So in this case, it would be no good to look at the needle at all because the needle is moving. So I'm going to keep my eye on the presser foot and guide the presser foot down the line. And now you can see how the needle is moving from left to right every time as it does the stitch. And as long as I keep my presser foot straight down that line, then those holes are going to fall either side of the line. And our goal with this one is to keep them even. So there we go, that looks pretty neat. Now my zigzag stitch goes much wider. So let's set that all the way out. Mine goes to a 7. So let's try that again and see how wide it goes this time. So my stitch length is the same. My feed dogs are only moving that piece of paper through the machine at the same speed that it was before. Still going nice and slow and keeping the same even stitches, but this time the stitches are wider. And here you can see the narrower stitch and the wider zigzag stitch. So again, it's handy for practice, also handy as a stitch reference chart for later on. This sheet is to practice turning corners as well as sewing some straight lines. So let me pop this under my presser foot and we'll get to this first corner. So again, I've got my stitches nice and slow so that I'm practicing my straight stitches and keeping control. And as I get down towards the corner here, I want to lift my foot and try and make sure that I get the needle as close to that corner as possible without overshooting. I think that will be my final stitch. I could take it 1 stitch more, but I think then it will go outside the line. Let's see. Oh, I don't know, that could be pretty good. Let's twist and see. Yes, now I'm pretty good on the line. So just a little bit in front of it. See if we can do it again. Hit the corner. Okay, we're good. You may need to fold your paper or roll it a little bit just to get it under the curve of your machine. Now here I can see I'm a little bit forward, so I can think I can do 1 more stitch. Cool. Now I'm a bit closer to that corner. And let's sew some more. So here we turned 1 direction for our corner, but as we continue along this way, the corners will be different. Let's see, so I'm coming up to my corner, and before I turned in this direction, this time I'm turning in this direction. So I'm leaving the needle down, lifting the presser foot, rotating my paper, and again this time I'm rotating my paper left. So you'll have 2 turns in one direction and then 1 turn in another direction. Now it's going to be quite difficult to exactly get into the corners. You see just here, mine wasn't quite right. And that's because, of course, our stitch length is variable on our machine. So if I had made my stitch length a little longer, instead of falling just a little short, maybe it would have hit it just here. And that's something else that you can practice with the corners. You can practice adjusting the length of your stitches as you get towards a corner so that you do your best to hit it exactly before turning. So here's one where we can have a little bit of fun and you can practice your straight lines and corners. I'm going to turn up my speed a little. Let's see if we can still stay in control. Whoa, suddenly you see that's much faster. But I can adjust it with the amount of pressure that I put on my foot pedal. Press harder, it goes faster. Stop, or press just a little. And it goes nice and slow and I stay in control. And get to one of those junctions, swivel my paper. Ooh, out of control. One more. I'm at another junction. Oh, I think I can go another stitch. There we go. And turn. And you can use this as a little bit of a maze. Just have some fun with it. Go in whatever direction you want. Maybe you could even use it to draw a design. Ooh, far too fast there. Or draw some letters or your name. One more stitch. Or just make an interesting design. So that's that one. You can see the practice that we've done there on the reverse, just for turning corners. I'm going to skip over this one, but this is another practice for straight lines and turning corners. And as you can see, there's lots of corners here and lots of straight line practice for you. I suggest go in a clockwise direction and then your next line, go in an anti-clockwise direction and so on, so that you practice turning corners both left and right. And then here we are sewing curves. Now this can be quite a challenge. I'm going to pop my presser foot down, turn my speed down nice and slow. And here, instead of allowing the machine to feed the fabric through or the paper through, we need to adjust it as we go. So I'm going to hold my paper and try and swivel it a little every stitch, so that I keep that needle on the line. And this time, I'm actually looking to see where the needle falls, because it's the needle that I want to fall on the line. And the tighter you go in the circle, the more difficult it will be, because the faster you will need to swivel your paper. Let's see how I did. That's pretty good. You can hardly see my stitches just there. You can hardly see my holes, so they have pretty much stayed on the line. And there you can see on the reverse. We've got some wavy lines down at the bottom for you to practice going like this. And then of course, when you're finished, when you're a master at these sheets, we have the practice with all of the fun shapes on. So if you are new to sewing, and you think these would be useful, hop on over to Sew Simple Bags. The link for them will be underneath this video if you're watching on YouTube, and add those into your sewing collection. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll subscribe if you found this interesting, and I look forward to seeing you here again very soon.